Okay, now it looks like we're good. Okay, so I think you can begin now.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to this session on starting garden seeds and all about seeds. It is that time of year to be um, doing this in our climate here. So I'm Diana Alfuth. I'm the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for University of Wisconsin's Division of Extension. My office is, well, at home right now, but typically it's in Ellsworth, and I serve mostly Pierce and St. Croix counties, as well as the surrounding areas with Polk and peripheral areas here. So I do anything horticulture. I teach and coordinate the Master Gardener programs. I do a lot of commercial horticulture, community gardens, school gardens, and I am here to answer questions. So anybody who has questions related to horticulture, whether it's lawns, trees, house plants, or vegetable gardens, that's what I'm here for, is to help with that. So I want to thank the libraries tonight for coordinating this and hosting it. Specifically, the 4 libraries that were really involved with it are the Augusta Library, Amory, Clear Lake, and Ellsworth. And I really appreciate them hosting this kind of thing because we're able to reach a whole lot more people, and you don't have to drive to come to this class. So as I said, it is the time of year to be starting our garden seeds. The snow is melting very quickly out there. It's kind of fun to look at the end of the day and see how much less snow is out there than there was at the beginning of the day. We have rain in the forecast on Wednesday. That'll melt even more. And depending on where you live, I know we're covering quite a geographic area here, we might be planting outdoors in mid-May or mid-June. And of course, we'll have to wait and see what the weather does. But typically, we look for a plant out date for warm season crops of around Memorial Day. And for cool season crops like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and things like that, even earlier, we can get things out there as soon as the soil dries up enough and can be worked without it clumping, because those crops can take even light frost. So we're going to talk today about starting your seeds. And first, I want to go over, well, what is a seed and what's in a seed? And this is a pretty elementary picture. In fact, I took it off the internet, and I think it was from a 2nd grade class curriculum. So it's may not be anything new for you, but I want to make sure that we are all on the same page and that we point out the important parts of a seed. So as we talk about seed starting, what we need to remember is that all seeds have a seed coat on them. And you can see that that kind of goes all along the outer edge here. And that's there just to protect the seed, because there are a lot of bad things that can happen to seeds. And all the important stuff has to stay in, and all the bad stuff has to stay out. So all seeds have a seed coat. On some, it's thicker than others. If you think of an apple seed, it's pretty hard and crunchy, or a walnut seed, it's even harder and crunchier. But some of our garden seeds like peas and beans, it's not a real thick coat. But inside every seed is basically a baby plant, okay? So that's what this is here. There's an embryo in the plant. If you take a bean seed, and you've probably done this, where you've split open a bean or even a peanut, and you can see a tiny, tiny, tiny little plant in there. And it has all of the important parts that a plant is going to need to sprout and get above ground. So that's just a little part of it. And then the rest of the seed, all this light tan stuff here, that's basically food. It's food for that baby plant, because something has to give carbohydrates or energy to that baby plant so that it can grow and get above ground and start doing photosynthesis. So that's why different seeds are different sizes. Bigger seeds like beans and corn have more food storage in it, or energy storage, and they can be deeper in the soil because they have more to live off of before they get up to doing photosynthesis. So the next slide here is going to show you how a seed germinates. And again, this is important for seed starting, and you'll find out more why later, but that seed has to be down below the soil, okay? And once the first step is for that seed to soak up water. And once it soaks up water, it starts all kinds of little chemical reactions inside that seed. There's different kinds of plant growth hormones that get activated and tell that seed to start growing. So the first thing that happens is that root, that first root called the radicle, comes out of the seed, and it knows to grow down. Okay, just knows to grow down. Even though these seeds are buried by a little bit of soil, they can sense light. So there's a little bit of light that infiltrates through the soil there, and especially infrared light, and the seed senses that, and that's partly how the seed knows if it should germinate or not. So if it's a dandelion that wants to grow in full sun, and that seed lands itself in the dark shade of the woods, it doesn't germinate because it can sense that it doesn't have enough light. So it'll stay there trying to remain viable for as long as possible, hoping a tornado comes through and knocks down the trees and brings out light, and then that dandelion will germinate. It's also why every time you work up the soil, there may be seeds deep down, weed seeds deep down in the soil, and when you work up and they don't germinate because they can sense that they're in the dark and it's too far to the surface before they would use up the food or the starch that's stored in that seed. So they sit there waiting for a gopher or something to come and flip that soil over, or a gardener. And then when that seed comes up to the surface and can sense the light, it will germinate. Okay, so seeds are very smart, plants are very smart, and nature has these little survival things built in. So once that seed soaks up water and all the little chemical reactions start going, it will send out this first root. Now remember that chemical reactions, I don't want to get deep into chemistry here, but chemical reactions tend to happen faster with increasing temperature. So when something's really cool, the chemical reactions are pretty not happening. And then as temperatures warm up, they start bouncing around. And that's what's happening outside right now. All of the buds and the seeds and things have been dormant because it's been cold, but now as they warm up, the chemical reactions and the plant growth hormones start going and stuff start happening. Insects start hatching, things start growing. It's the same way with why we put food in the freezer to preserve it, because at that cold temperature, all the chemical reactions stop and your beans no longer ripen, so they stay wholesome. So these chemical reactions get going here. The warmer it is, the faster a seed is going to germinate, because that warmer temperature is going to get those chemical reactions going. Now there's a limit, okay? So you get above 90 degrees and a lot of these chemical reactions stop happening, but there's a big difference between 55 degrees and 70 degrees if you're a seed or a plant. So as this radicle or this first root starts growing down, then comes out the little stem, and it's always going to be bent over. You can see the seed coat is breaking away now because this part of the seed has swollen because of the water that it took up. Those are the cotyledons. That's where that food or that carbohydrate energy is stored. That's what this plant is living off of right now while it's still below ground. Carbohydrates are coming out of these cotyledons, going through the stem. That's what's giving the roots the energy it needs to divide cells and grow a bigger root system. But you can see that the very tip of this is already starting to get green the closer it gets to the soil surface. And as soon as it pops up, you see that this stem is already green. That's because as soon as the light hits it, chlorophyll starts forming in there. And chlorophyll is where photosynthesis is done. And photosynthesis is the process of in sunlight where the plant takes oxygen and carbon dioxide and water and forms a carbohydrate molecule or a sugar molecule. And that's a plant's food. So fertilizer is not really a plant, is not really food, even though the labels always call it that. Fertilizer is more like your one-a-day vitamin. The actual food is the carbohydrates or the sugars that are made during photosynthesis. So these plants have this race where they try to get above ground, and as soon as they do, they're now exhausting the energy that was in these cotyledons, and now they have to start making it with photosynthesis. So you'll see that in the next picture here, baby leaves are coming out, and then these first foliage leaves are out, and now there's nothing left of that seed. All the energy has been used up, and now we have leaves actually doing the photosynthesis. So this is important to remember as you start seeds indoors, because anything that goofs up any one of these stages is going to either kill your plant or affect its strength and viability going on. All right, so seeds to success. The first thing you need, one thing I want to mention is seed starting is not difficult, okay? People have been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. Our ancestors, even our grandparents and great-grandparents have been doing it indoors, and they didn't have any fancy heating mats or grow lights or anything like that. So don't make it real complicated. Yes, you can get into big elaborate systems, but you really don't need to. You can grow decent garden quality transplants without anything fancy. Okay, there's only a few things that you absolutely need. The first one is some good seeds, okay? And the good seeds, what I mean by that is purchase your seeds from a good quality source. So you can go to Walmart and they'll have these little seed stacks there and it's 10 cents a packet. I don't know. I think we should invest a little bit more than that. A good quality seed, there are going to be several things. Now here's a seed packet, and I'm not promoting fairy remorse by any reason. It's just that when I went on the internet to find a good picture of a seed packet, this one was handy. But what you should look for on a seed packet, and I'm going to change my little pen color here to blue to show up better here. Okay, you're on the front, there's going to be the name of the variety. Okay, so this is a squash and it's called Black Beauty. And it's important that you don't just buy generic squash. Most everything's going to have some variety, but when you go to deciding which varieties you're going to grow, you really need to pay attention to the cultivars, which cultivar and variety is pretty much an interchangeable word here. But in this case, Black Beauty and a good quality, reputable seed company, this is actually going to be Black Beauty in this packet, okay? There are some cases where you may not actually growing Black Beauty because they didn't put the right seeds in there, okay? And that's why it's important to go with a good company. Now, Ferry Morris has been around since 1856. You can see that up here. So, they probably have some good customers and that makes them good quality. This one tells you the days to harvest, great for slicing. And then on the back of the package, you definitely need to read this. If you're buying seeds in the grocery or in the store, some grocery stores have it, but otherwise Fleet Farm and hardware stores or garden centers, then you can flip through the packets and you can read them. Otherwise, if you're ordering things online or from a catalog, there will be good descriptions in there, and make sure you read through that things. And there's several important things to note, okay? So first is going to be a description of it, okay? So this is going to be, can mature to 10 to 12 inches long. Make sure you are growing what you want, and everybody is different. So people will often ask me, oh, what's the best kind of bean to grow? It's like, I can't tell you that because I have different tastes than you. I have different garden than you. I have different space. I have different climate than somebody who's 100 miles north of me. I maybe want to just eat mine fresh, whereas you might want to freeze yours. And so some of them are better for freezing. All those kinds of things make a difference on what varieties you choose for your individual garden. There are climbing varieties and bush varieties and early maturing and later maturing and best for slicing, best for fresh eating, best for canning, you name it. So make sure that you know what your goal is on what you want. If you just want to grow some beans, it probably doesn't matter. Just get whatever beans you want. But think about what attributes that one has. There's a reason there are so many varieties to choose from. Catalogs are an inch thick these days, right? And there's 50 different kinds of green beans in there. Well, they each have something unique about them that might be beneficial for you. Okay, so then it also has the planting instructions. So this is a squash. This is not one we would likely be starting indoors, although some people do. Vine crops, the squash and pumpkins, they don't like transplanting very well. So if you do start them indoors, you would start them only about 3 weeks early. And it's best to start them like in a peat pot or a newspaper pot or something where you're not going to disturb the roots when you go to transplanting. But most of these are direct seeded out in the garden. In the northern areas, it might be beneficial to start them indoors because you need to get that jump on the growing season. Okay, but so this one says after all danger of frost is past, sunny location. All vegetables need a sunny location. Okay, we really don't have anything vegetable wise that grows in shade. You can, if you have part shade, you can usually limp some lettuce and herbs along, but any of these things that flower and set fruit really need full sun, which means 6 hours of direct midday sun per day. Okay, so it tells you how to plant them, and it tells you when to harvest. So these are summer squash, so plant early and often. And then the other things here that are really important is it tells you the days to germination, the planting depth, the days to harvest, and your spacing. And that's super, super important. So often gardeners try to jam too much too close together in a garden, and then you get problems. Not only do the plants compete with each other, but they hold more humidity, so they're more susceptible to fungal diseases. It's hard for you to get in there and weed or maintain. It's hard for you to get in there and harvest. So definitely pay attention to the spacings on the seed packet for whatever crop it is that you're trying to grow. And if you find some packet that doesn't have the spacing, or you're confused about it or whatever, UW Extension does have some vegetable growing publications that you can get that have kind of like the basics for spacing and how many feet between rows or between plants, that sort of a thing. The other thing that's really important is, and I know it's a little hard to see down here, but on every package, it says packed for 17, sell by December 2017. So, okay, this is an old picture, right? But always buy fresh seeds that have this year's date on it. By law, the Department of Ag, they make all of these companies test their seeds. So they have nursery inspectors, seed inspectors that test their seeds to make sure that they will germinate. So they're not selling packages of dead seeds, basically. They have to do germination tests to show that at least 90% of the seeds in that packet are viable and will germinate. They test them for diseases, because there are some diseases that can be carried on seeds, and all of the packets have to be labeled. Now, every now and then you'll find a packet of seeds that has a little sticker over it, and it has a new date on it. And if you peel that sticker off, underneath it was last year's date, and you think, come on, they're just, cheating. But they can do that if they go through the germination testing again, and there's still an adequate viability in that seed packet. Okay, but you don't want to get the 10-cent packet of seeds that's 3 years old, because you don't know how those seeds have been stored. Some seeds, some crops, the seeds can last for 5-10 years, and others really after 1 year, they're not all that viable. So always buy seeds with the current year on them. And if you order from a reputable online seed place, you're going to get this year's seeds. Okay. All right, if you're saving seeds, and there is a lot of interest in saving seeds from last year's crop or save seeds from this coming year's crop for next year, that's definitely doable, but there are several things to keep in mind. First, you have to make sure that that crop or that fruit has fully matured before you save seeds. So you see up here in this picture where there's a green pepper and there's seeds in there. Green peppers aren't actually ripe. Peppers are ripe when they're red. And so why that one's in this picture, again, I stole it off the internet, it's not really a good example. Squash really should get yellowed and overripe. Cucumbers, they should be, you know, those big orange fat things that are starting to get mushy. That's when those seeds are fully mature and ripe in there. So don't, even if you pick a plant, like let's say you pick green beans and you like them really thin and tender and stuff for eating, if you saved the seeds out of those, they wouldn't have gotten physiologically mature enough to save and germinate the next year, okay? All the processes have to go, that little embryo has to form in there. There has to be a nice clump of carbohydrate storage in that seed. So if you want to save, make sure that your crop is fully mature. Also, some varieties are sterile. They never get viable seeds. Okay, so if you're wanting to really get into seed starting, if you're going to be growing big gardens or something like that, research what it is that you're growing and or wanting to save seeds from, and make sure that it's not something that's not going to set viable seeds. Okay. And also never save plants or seeds from a diseased plant. So especially like tomatoes, a lot of people are wanting to save tomato seeds, which is easy to do. But if your tomatoes had bacterial speck or bacterial spot on them, or late blight, those diseases can survive on the seeds. So if you save those seeds and then next year you plant them, your plants are going to have those diseases again. So don't try to skimp, you know, thinking you're going to save a lot of money by saving seeds. Unless, I mean, if you're growing a lot of something, you can, but really a packet of tomato seeds that's going to have 30 or more seeds in it is a few dollars. And they're going to come disease free. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying don't save seeds, okay, but there is a concern. And the other concern is if it's a hybrid or not. So whenever you purchase a package of seeds, that variety will be there and it'll say if it's a hybrid, it may, you actually use the word hybrid, or it might have F1 on it, and that stands for an F1 hybrid. So what a hybrid is when the breeders or whoever is selling those seeds, they specifically took parent A, the mama, and parent B, the daddy. They put the pollen from parent B onto the flowers of the mother plant, and what's coming out of that will be a specific variety. So if it's a hybrid, it was very intentionally done for those seeds. If you save the seeds, you're not going to get that variety. So here's the picture again. We're kind of back in second grade, but here are the parts of a flower, and the male parts are these anthers out here. That's where the pollen forms. The female part is the stigma. This is where the pollen has to land. So the male pollen lands on here. If the plant says, yeah, that'll make a good daddy, it will allow a pollen tube to grow down through here, down into the ovary and ovule. And this is where fertilization actually takes place. And as soon as that happens, again, poof, we got all these plant hormones going on and stuff. And what that does now is it tells this plant, let's say it's it could be an apple, it could be a squash plant. It tells this plant, okay, we're going to grow a fruit in order to reproduce, in order to produce seeds and reproduce. And so that fruit is right here. And that is what swells and forms your squash. So this is the part that you're going to eat. And that's all female tissue. So that's the variety that you planted. That's the Black Beauty squash that you planted. Okay. But now the seeds in there are, have been fertilized with who knows what. Okay. Whatever rogue squash the bee visited before it landed on this flower. So now if you save the seeds from that, from this squash, you're going to have something else. It's going to be half what you planted and half whatever else, wherever the pollen came from. So the seeds that you grow next year could be what we call frankenfruit. And this happens if you've ever grown squash or gourds or pumpkins, and volunteer plants have grown up the next year from seeds that have were produced that year, you start getting these funny looking things, and it doesn't look like a butternut squash, and it doesn't look like a gourd, and it doesn't look like a pumpkin, but they look kind of goofy. Not that you can't eat them, they're edible, but they might very well taste bad or have some other bad attribute to them. So if you are growing a hybrid plant, you cannot save the seeds from them. You will not get what you planted originally. Okay. There are some varieties or some vegetables though that are called either open pollinated or heirloom varieties. And these are varieties that have been around for so long that they can typically like pollinate themselves. And then what you get from the seeds is pretty much the same as what it was. So most of the time people are interested in open pollinated tomatoes. Okay, tomatoes, let's face it, most of us here tonight, we're talking tomatoes because 86% of home gardeners grow tomatoes. It's the number one crop because, you know, there's two things that money can't buy: true love and homegrown tomatoes. So everybody likes to grow tomatoes. And there's been a lot of interest in heirloom varieties. Well, tomatoes pretty much pollinate themselves. They don't rely on bees. They don't need pollen to go from one plant to another. So the pollen is quite heavy in there, and the pollen just gets distributed from the anthers onto the end of the stigma there when the wind blows it. Okay. Now bumblebees are extra useful because bumblebees have this wing motion that as they flap, they really vibrate it. So if they get on a tomato flower and they vibrate it, it causes even better pollination, right? But because the tomato can pollinate itself, it's not like an apple that won't pollinate itself. It needs pollen from a different plant. If it's an heirloom variety, you can get seeds that will produce pretty close to that variety. Technically, they're slightly genetically different because it's a recombination of genes, but probably not noticeable. Okay, so if you want to save seeds, just make sure you're doing an open pollinated or heirloom variety. And honestly, I don't know of any real like squash or pumpkins, the vine crops that are open pollinated because they need that bee to bring stuff in from elsewhere. And so you've almost always have something different coming out. Okay. So whether you're buying seeds, and this year, so this last year when the pandemic hit, a lot of people all of a sudden decided they were going to grow a garden. And so the seed companies are really caught off guard, and they ran out of a lot of things. They had real delays and stuff. This year they were a little more prepared for it, but there will be, if you go to order certain things, there will be shortages or outages. And sometimes it's a matter of the seed company has a bin of it in the back room, but they don't have enough labor or time to package them up into the little seed packets that they send out. So sometimes there's just a delay, or sometimes it'll say temporarily out of stock until they get more packaged. So be prepared for that. In other cases, they're totally out. And that's because a lot of our seeds are actually produced overseas in other countries. There are massive seed production fields. And so the seed companies are always a couple years ahead, so, or behind, however you want to look at it. But they're like, last fall, they were ordering seeds for 2 or 3 years from now, because then they go into production. So it's not always, a lot of times there just isn't any seed available, okay? So one of the recommendations is that if you have a particular variety of something that you really like, buy 2 packets this year and store one for next year. As long as you store it correctly, they should be viable next year. Or if you have leftovers from last year, if they've been stored correctly, you can plant them this year. Okay, so the keys to storing seeds, or if you're saving seeds, so let's say you've collected seeds, or you're going to collect seeds from your tomatoes at the end of this year and you want to plant them next year. The keys to storing seeds are to keep it cool. And remember, a seed, even though it looks like it's just laying there, it's dormant, it's not dead. There are still little chemical reactions and things going on in that seed as it's laying on a table or sitting in a seed packet. It's still alive, and it's using some of the stored energy in that seed to stay alive, okay? It's like, you know, breathing really shallowly, but it is still breathing. So that's why a seed might remain viable for 3 or 4 years, but then after 5 years, it's used up too much of its stored energy reserves. So now it's not viable anymore. So cool temperatures, remember, slow down those chemical reactions and will keep it from using stored energy as much as possible. And that's going to maintain viability for longer. So cool, we're talking about not freezing, but refrigerator is good, or anything really below 60 degrees. 45 to 55 degrees is probably ideal, but you don't need it to be freezing, and you don't want it to be too much warmer than that. You also want those seeds to be dry, so don't put it in a humid place, and that is sometimes the problem with refrigerators, because there is a certain amount of humidity in refrigerators and stuff, so that your produce doesn't dry up and things like that. So dry, not humid, is important. If you're saving seeds, you absolutely want to make sure that you've cleaned them all up, you lay them out, get them super, super dry before you put them in a container like a plastic bag or a glass jar or anything, because if there's any moisture in those seeds yet, that will be in there, the seeds will soak it up, and that will goof up that whole process again that I went through at the beginning. So if you are storing seeds, check them every now and then. Make sure there's not any condensation building up in the container. If there is, you need to spread them out and let them dry a little bit more and repackage them. So cool and dry. And how long they'll remain viable is very dependent on the species. So like cucumber seeds, maybe a year or 2. I've planted 5-year-old bean seeds. When they opened King Tut's tomb, they found cornflower seeds in there, and some of them germinated. So obviously that was the perfect storage conditions down with King Tut. But there is a lot of variability on species for how long they'll last. Now, if you've stored seeds, or maybe you have some old seeds hanging around and you look at the date on the package and it's like, oh my gosh, they're 3 years old, I wonder if I should bother planting them. You can do a quick little germination test. And all you need to do is take a damp piece of paper towel and put like 10 seeds in it. Okay, make sure that that paper towel is good and to the point where if you squeeze it, you could actually bring out some water. You want plenty of water in there because those seeds need to absorb that water. And then wrap it up, put it in a Ziploc bag, and just put it on your kitchen counter and leave it there for about a week. And then unroll it and see what you've got. If you have 5 out of the 10 have germinated, then you have a 50% viability of those seeds there. So maybe you'll plant them twice as thick as you otherwise would. Okay, here in this picture too, you can see the what I talked about earlier. So this white part here, this is the seed coat, and it's soaked up water, and now these things that are shooting out here are the radicle, or that first root that I talked about, and then here's the stem, and in the seeds here yet are the cotyledons. That's where all the energy is. You can see that kind of light green in there, and that's what that seed is going to live off of until it forms some green stems or leaves to do its growth. Okay, so you can do a quick germination test to see if your seeds are worth planting or throw them in the garbage. Okay. Now, growing tomatoes from seed, and yes, we're going to talk about tomatoes because, again, that's what most people are growing, but this could easily be peppers or eggplant, or if you're doing cool season crops like broccoli or cauliflower, they're a little touchier, especially if you're not an experienced seed starter. If you haven't grown seeds or started seeds indoors before, I would say to stick with some of the easier ones like tomatoes and peppers. Broccoli and cauliflower, they are more of a challenge because they like cool temperatures, and your house is warmer than they like. And so they can get really lanky and stuff really quick. But the key is to start your seeds indoors for these warm season crops 5 to 8 weeks before you expect to plant them outdoors. Okay, so in the southern part of the state, Madison and stuff, oh, they're planting outdoors easily by May 15th. Okay, in the central part of the state, so Eau Claire, Hudson, Stevens Point, the zone 4 areas and stuff, we really are best to look at Memorial Day. And if you're farther north, like Frederick or even Amory and stuff, well then, you might be looking at a week or so later. Now, the problem is we never know what the year's weather is going to bring. It could turn out that we could be planting 2 weeks earlier, or we might get a really cold spell and need to be planting 2 weeks later. The key with things like tomatoes, though, is they are a warm season crop. They don't like cold temperatures. Putting them out early, they sit out there and shiver. Okay, so we don't, even though danger of frost might be past, we really want there to be good warm soil temperatures and good warm night temperatures, because otherwise they aren't those, again, chemical reactions don't happen when it's cool, and tomato growing is a chemical reaction. So we don't want to get them out there too early. Okay, so the only thing that you really need, that other than seeds, to buy to be successful is purchased sterile seed starting mix. Okay, so seed starting mix, you can see the picture in the bottom right corner. There are different brands available, but it's typically a really finely ground peat moss or sphagnum moss, and it's sterile. Not only is it sterile because the pH is naturally lower and stuff, but they've pasteurized it, and little seedlings can be killed quickly by diseases, specifically one that we call damping off. And damping off is basically a water mold pythium that gets on the surface of the growing mix, and it just runs across the surface, and it gets these little seedlings, and it basically strangles them right at soil level, and they just tip over and fall, and you can lose them all in a day. So that organism won't be in a sterile seed starting mix. So that's why you never want to use a potting mix or soil from your garden. I know when I was a kid, my mom used to get garden soil and she'd bake it in the oven to sterilize it, and the house would stink. That's not a good idea. Not only are you killing all the good things in there, but it's not reliable in killing the bad things, and it stinks. Plus, a seed starting mix is lighter weight, so it holds moisture better and allows for better root development quickly. So you can buy all kinds of stuff for seed starting. There are seed starting kits. They have the little domes on them, and they have expandable little peat pellets and all kinds of cute little things. If you want to use them, that's fine, okay? But you can just as easily recycle something at home. So I often use like food carryout containers or bakery containers, the little clamshell things. They're great for starting it. My mom used to always use egg cartons, and that's a great thing to use. You can use newspaper and make little pots that you can fill with soil just by molding them around a soup can. So what the container is doesn't matter. All you need is to make sure that it has a drainage hole in it. So if you're recycling a carryout container, just poke a few holes in with a knife, and it just needs to be 2 inches deep. Okay. So once you have your seed starting mix, you have decided on your container, then all you do is first off, moisten that seed starting mix, because when it's in the bag, it can be kind of dry. And if something gets too dried out, especially peat, it can become hydrophobic, meaning it repels water. So you've probably done that if you've let a house plant or a container outside get too dry and you pour water on it and the water just kind of bubbles up on it and doesn't sink down in. Okay. And that's not a good thing, because then it runs down the edge and it doesn't actually get to where the plant roots are. So moisten that potting mix first. Just put it in a little bucket, pour some water in, stir it around, let it sit for half an hour. Then fill your containers. Okay. And again, you only need about 2 inches. So you can see down here, here's my carryout container from Mama Maria's restaurant in North Hudson, one of my favorite Italian restaurants. And it makes a wonderful little seed starting thing. So fill your container with the 2 inches and then put your seed on the top. So you can see up in the top right here, this is using some little cell pack things that you can buy. There's that tomato seed right in the middle. Okay, then just put a little sifting of the potting mix over the top. Now, I like to use a little kitchen sifter that I have, because I want them all to be covered about the same depth, because then I'm going to get more even germination. And that's important, that they all germinate at the same time. The seed should be planted 1 to 2 times deep as the smallest diameter of the seed. So a tomato seed is about 1/8 of an inch round, but it's only less than 1/16 of an inch flat. So 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch covering a tomato seed is all you want. If you bury it too deep, it's not going to have enough stored energy to get above ground before it's doing photosynthesis, so it may not even bother to germinate. Okay, if you do it too shallow, then the roots aren't getting established well. So 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch on a tomato seed or a pepper seed or a broccoli seed, they're all about the same. And then mist it. So I like to use a little misting bottle, like down in this bottom left-hand corner here. And the reason that I mist it, once you put that little extra layer of stuff on top of the planting mix, the reason to use a mister is because you can water that seed into place without dislodging it. So if you try to pour like a little watering can water on it, it hits this potting mix and it digs a little hole and it moves the seed around and stuff. So a mister is good with that. And now the key is, the first thing for that seed to germinate is to soak up water. Okay, so the key is to keep that seed moist until it germinates. If you get that seed wet and then let it fully dry out, if it started to soak up the water and the chemical reaction started in that seed and now it totally dries out, the seed will just die. Okay, so that's the reason we put the plastic over it. So my carryout container here has this handy little plastic dome on it. Some of the kits that you buy with the little greenhouse things, they have the plastic dome on it. If you're just using some other kind of like a Tupperware or some kind of a little recycled container, you can use plastic wrap, or you can just stick the whole thing in a bag, a plastic bag, and close the end and tent it up so that there's a little dome there. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. And that plastic only stays on until the seeds germinate. So depending on how long that will be, will depend on the temperature. Okay, so this is where seed starting mats come in. They're like a little heating pad, but never use a human heating pad because they're not made for it, and you can end up with electric shocks and issues and stuff. But seed starting mats are basically a little mat that has little wires through it that heat up, and that warms the soil mix. And because it warms it, the process goes faster, and so the seeds germinate faster. And then you take the mat away, you turn off the mat as soon as you have germination. If you happen to have in-floor heating in your house somewhere, you can set the trays on or the containers on the floor, and that will warm it a little more. Otherwise, top of the refrigerator is usually pretty warm. And if you don't have anything, it's fine. You can still germinate your seeds. It's just probably going to take a couple more days for them to sprout. So no big deal. Okay. So you put them in a warm place. As soon as you see one little speck of seed coming up, and it's going to be that curved over stem, remember in that first picture there, that curved little stem is going to be coming up. As soon as you see that, you take that plastic dome off, because we now want that air to dry out some, because you can see in the picture here all the condensation that builds up in there, and that's high humidity, and high humidity is encouraging for diseases, including that damping off that I talked about. Okay, so we don't want it too wet in there. We don't want it too humid. It also can, especially if there's any sunlight hitting it, it can heat up really hot in there. And then your plants, your little seedlings will grow like 4 inches in a day and be really floppy and lanky and stuff. So as soon as you see any seeds germinating, you take that dome off. That's why I mentioned earlier that I would want to cover all the seeds with the same amount of potting mix so that they all germinate pretty uniformly. Because if one is up and growing and the other is 2 days away from germinating, then it's a little harder to manage when they're young like this. Okay. And then as soon as they start growing, you want to put them in high light conditions, but not high heat. So if you can put them somewhere where the temperature is going to be like 65 to 68 degrees, that's perfect. They can tolerate up to 75, but even that's getting kind of warm for them. If you have warm conditions and or not super bright light for them, that's when you get the lanky, spindly, weak plants, and they grow really fast with a thin stem. And that tells you that they need more light and they need cooler conditions. So, we think about, greenhouses, they grow these things in greenhouses and greenhouses are warm. That's not actually true. When the greenhouses start getting 70 degrees, they're turning on fans and opening roof vents and trying to cool it down in there. But they also have the brightest light possible because they have that sunlight coming in. In our houses, we don't have that bright light because even though the sun's coming in through your window, those windows have been coated with all kinds of things to keep your carpet and couch from fading out and all that sort of thing. So the light on the inside, the sunlight on the inside of your window is much, much lower than the sunlight on the outside. So, so that's why we really don't want it to be super warm, because then you'll get those lanky conditions on there. But you don't need anything special for lights. You can grow seedlings, especially tomatoes and peppers that are only going to be growing in the house for 6 to 8 weeks. You can grow them with natural light. If you have a south-facing window, that's great. You can do it on a west window. Note that those plants are going to turn or bend towards the light, just like they are in this picture. And that's because of plant growth hormones in there that are making those plants bend. So you need to turn them every day, rotate them around. Also make sure that it's not getting, if this is a windowsill in maybe like a 4-season porch or something that's not heated as well, if we get cold spells, it can get pretty cool next to that windowsill. So make sure you monitor how cold it's getting on that windowsill, but also make sure that room's not getting too warm. So if you have these in a south window in your dining room, you know, in mid-April with that sun so strong, it can easily get in the upper 70s in your dining room, and that's too warm. Okay, so monitor those temperatures, but you can grow good seedlings just with natural light on a windowsill. You can also use artificial light or supplemental light. All you need are fluorescent lights. So the basic shop light, the 4-foot long shop light fluorescent bulb, that's all you need. You just need to set it up somewhere. LED lights are very useful as well. What's important is that you're getting enough lumens, okay? And that lumens refer to the brightness of the light. You can get on your smartphone, you can download light meter apps, or if you have a camera that has a light meter on it, you can test how much light is hitting your seedlings. So you want a minimum of 2,000 to 3,000 lumens, more is better. As far as the wavelengths or the colors of the light, you want it in that 5 to 6,500 or 6,500 range. Sometimes if you buy a light, if you're buying LED lights, or if you're buying fluorescent lights, or if you're buying a light labeled as a plant grow light, it will actually be on there. But I wouldn't worry about the kelvins things. And again, just a basic cool fluorescent shop light is all you need, because that's what the plants need to grow leaves. We don't want our seedlings to set flower indoors. We're only growing leaves. Once they get outside into the natural sunlight, then they can worry about flowers. That's when they need the warm levels of the light spectrum, is when they're going to be setting flowers. Okay. If you have a windowsill where the plants are getting sunlight during the day, and then you have a little fluorescent light, there are under counter lights that are only 2 feet long or something, and you have that set up and you turn it on in the evening to extend the day to 16 to 20 hours, you're going to grow wonderful seedlings. Okay. Again, just make sure your room doesn't get too warm. And the lights need to be no more than 4 inches from the top of the foliage. If it's too high, the light gets weaker and weaker really fast. So 4 inches, make sure it's something that you can adjust as the plants grow. Watering, you want to keep them moist. You never want your little seedlings to wilt, but don't overwater them. So the very surface of the soil should dry out slightly between waterings. If that surface is wet all the time, you're going to get diseases in there. You can bottom water. So if you're using cell packs or something that have a lot of holes in the bottom, you can just set those in a tray with water, and that's what the picture is showing, and it'll soak up the water from below, and then the surface never really gets super damp because it doesn't need to be wet on the surface. The roots are, an inch below, and then you have a lot less problems with diseases. Otherwise, make sure you're using a really fine watering system so that you don't dislodge the little seedlings there. If you are bottom watering, don't let them sit in water for more than 30 minutes, because otherwise that soil can get overly waterlogged, and roots need oxygen in order to grow. So if it's too wet, they will drown. So don't let them sit in the water for more than 30 minutes. And again, you're probably going to be watering them every day. So try not to let them wilt. If they do wilt, they'll perk up, but they've been damaged. Okay. It's going to take them a little while to recover from that. So try not to let them wilt. Okay. If your house is super dry, you might get some little browning edges on the tips of leaves. This is a house plant, but it's the same thing. Okay. If it's too wet, too much humidity, you can have diseases and stuff. So typically once they're out from under that dome, you're not going to have a humidity problem in your house. But there are some people who have maybe like a glassed in little porch or something, and it doesn't have enough ventilation. And if the sun's coming in and it gets really hot in there, you can get some condensation going. And so just be aware of that. Fertilizing, you don't need to fertilize right at the beginning, okay? Not until after the seeds have germinated. So don't put any fertilizer into the seed starting mix. Wait until they've got their first set of true leaves coming out, and then you can fertilize them. And fertilize them lightly. Okay, so if you're using a water soluble fertilizer like a houseplant fertilizer where you put a few drops in some water, or a Miracle Grow kind of a thing, use it at half strength and fertilize every other week. Okay, if you decide to start your little seedlings in small little cells and then you transplant them to bigger pots later on, when you transplant them, you'll be transplanting them into more of a potting mix, not a seed starter mix. And that potting mix will have a certain amount of nutrients in it, whether it's, you know, the Miracle Grow where it's labeled and it has it added, or if it's just a normal potting mix, there's inherently some more nutrients in there. So if you do a transplant, wait 2 weeks before you fertilize. And then you'll fertilize every other week. Once the seedlings are about 4 inches tall, you can go up to full strength fertilizer. If you're using an organic type of fertilizer, they're usually lower in their analysis, less nitrogen and stuff. So you might need to put it on every week rather than every other week. You can also use slow release granules like Osmocote or something, and you'll just sprinkle those on the top. And most of those will last at least 6 weeks. It just a little fertilizer is released every time that you water. So you could do that as well. If you're seeding outdoors, so not everything gets started indoors, right? With your indoor plants, once you hit 8 weeks and it's growing conditions outside, they'll be ready to plant outside. But you do need to harden them off first, because indoors, you know, it's just not as rough as the outdoors are. So about 2 weeks before you expect to plant your seedlings outdoors, you should start introducing them to outdoors. So the first day you put them outside in the shade for the day. No direct sunlight. The second day, you let them have like a half an hour of morning sun, like from 9 to 10, and then increase that about 15 to 30 minutes a day until they're out in full sun. And over the course of 2 weeks, and then they'll be ready to put out in the garden. If you just put them out in the sunlight too fast, the leaves will scorch, because again, the light conditions inside are so much weaker than outside. If you're planting directly outdoors, if you're seeding directly outdoors, and this is with, like in the picture there, that's peas. Okay, peas don't transplant well, and a lot of things, it's just best to plant them directly outdoors, like carrots and leaf lettuce and stuff like that. It's really no different than planting them indoors. You want to plant them at the proper depth, and that's dependent on the size of the seed. You want to plant for the fastest germination possible. So don't plant if the soil temperature is really cold yet. And you can use a soil thermometer or a kitchen thermometer. Just go stick it in the soil 2 inches down and see what the temperature is. Clay soils warm up slower than sandy soils. If you know, it'll depend on the weather. It'll depend on how cloudy it's been. It'll depend if we get a late snow, that sort of thing. So the warmer the soil, the faster your seeds are going to germinate. And also remember that those seeds need to soak up water, and that's the first step in germinating. So make sure that you keep them moist with a light sprinkling every day if it doesn't rain until they germinate. Okay. And the reason we want them to germinate as fast as possible is because the longer seed lays there out in the soil, the more likely it's going to get eaten by a bird or a mouse or attacked by a fungus or a bacteria or something like that. Okay. So that's it. That is it for my basic presentation. So, let's see. We have a couple of questions in the chat that I got here. One is, if the seeds germinate in a paper towel, can you plant those? Like the ones that were in that picture? Yes, you can. Now, if you're doing little seeds, like you're testing lettuce or carrots or something like that, they can get pretty hard to handle once they have a little root sticking out there. Okay. But something like beans and peas, a lot of people will pre-sprout pea seeds by soaking them in a jar of water for a couple of days in the house, and then they swell up, they like double in size, and then you'll start seeing the little root coming down, and then they plant those. And again, that's all part of the goal to get that seed to germinate as fast as possible once it's outside, because otherwise they're susceptible to the perils of the outdoor world. Okay, birds and fungus and things like that. So so that's, you can indeed plant those seeds that you germinated in the paper towel. There's also a question about using pea for cover crop. So cover crops are a great thing to use in a garden, especially if you've had a garden in production for a long time. You tend to get some disease and insect and nutrition issues going on and stuff. And so putting part of the garden in fallow or in a cover crop for a year, or even for half a year, like later in the year, to keep it from growing up into weeds, is a really good idea. With UW Extension here, we've got a couple of fact sheets on using cover crops in the home garden. And one is peas and oats. These are not the garden peas that you grow as a crop. They're a different kind of field pea that the whole point, the reason you grow peas is because peas are a legume, and they fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere onto nodules in the roots. And so then when that plant dies, that nitrogen in the nodules gets released and is now available for your other plants. So that's one of the main reasons for using peas as opposed to oats or something. Most people, when they use field peas in a cover crop, mix it with something. Peas and oats or something like that, just so that they get a good ground cover. But what you use for a cover crop depends on what your goal is. If it's to fix nitrogen, if it's to add organic matter, that kind of thing. And as I said, we've got some fact sheets that, or somebody can, you can always email me directly if you have more questions, and I can help you with that. Another question was, can you use snow water for starting seeds? Sure, you can, but tap water, well water, city water is fine for starting seeds. Snow water is not going to be anything magical, or and nothing, any water is fine. So, but better get out there and get that snow water fast because it's melting. Let's see. I don't see any other questions yet. So again, we were scheduled to go till 7:30 here, and it's just 7:30, which I'm always really happy when my presentations actually get done on time, because I tend to go on and on. But if anyone has any questions about seed starting or anything else, you're always welcome to email me. And again, I should have left my contact information up on the screen longer. So there's my email address. Because again, we're working remotely, you can always call the Pierce County Extension office and leave a message, and I'll get back to you. And another thing is, there is a Facebook page called Western Wisconsin Gardening and Horticulture. If you're on Facebook and you want to follow that, a lot of times, we post a lot of things there, like class opportunities and new research things and resources and that sort of thing. So you might find that useful. But again, any other questions, you're welcome to email me or call me at any time. So I think that's it, and we can just wrap it up then. So Stacy, is there anything more?